Hey there, everybody. Welcome. We have now reached episode number 10 in A Rebel Without Applause, the Bill Kalmanson podcast. Thank you once again for joining me when you do and how you do. Little word of advice. I've been accepted into iTunes, so iTunes, Google Play, and Stitcher. So I'm now available to be ignored from Siberia to Santa Monica. So that's good news. The tune I played, that was Tadd Dameron's Hot House. And for all of you jazz know-it-alls, that is derived from the same very chords that Cole Porter's What Is This Thing Called Love? It shares the same chords, and it was a Tadd Dameron composition called Hot House, played by all the hot players, Charlie Parker and the like. And that was me on my clarinet, and that's what I'm trying to do, just keep the licorice alive. People say, Bill, why do you play the clarinet? And I go, hey, it's the only thing I got that's long, black, and hard. So 2 out of 3 ain't bad, so there you go. Anyway, I invite you once again to grab a paddle and row your boat gently down the stream of my consciousness. As I've said before, I am just a lonely merchant of mirth, an abstract and brief chronicler of this cockeyed caravan called life. So please, if you will, I hope you can tolerate my musings about everything and nothing. And by the way, if you do listen to this, and if you do like it, and if you are in some fashion amused, or it's an otherwise more productive use of your time than watching back issues or episodes of Gilligan's Island, maybe you could write a review, a few words of support on the iTunes podcast website or application. So, what's up? We're here approaching the end of August. Labor Day is fast upon us. The dog days of summer rolling to an end. I can see sort of the harbinger of fall on the horizon. And what's up? Well, firstly, and most importantly in this week, I think it's time to honor or at least pay tribute or talk about in some honest fashion John McCain. Who was this guy? He recently journeyed to the other side, this happy American warrior. He was the son and grandson of some big-time Navy admirals. He followed in those same illustrious warrior footsteps. He actually he did go to the Naval Academy, where he graduated near the very bottom of his class. He was a clown. He was a cut-up. He was a wild man. Became a reckless fighter jock who crashed 2 airplanes before he ever got to Vietnam. His life story, as I reflect back on it, it reminded me a lot of, he was like a modern-day Prince Hal or a Hotspur. I think more closely to Prince Hal. And if you don't know who Prince Hal was, he was the subject of Henry IV, Part 1, Henry IV, Part 2, and the prince later becomes Henry V. So if you get a chance to read those plays, it could shed some light, I think, on the life of John McCain, or at the very least, they're great plays. And in both cases, Prince Hal was a reckless, a bad boy. He was the son of the king, whose own legitimacy was in question at the time. That was Bolingbroke, who had taken over from Richard II, or actually imprisoned Richard II, taken over the throne, and his son, Bolingbroke's son, was Prince Hal, who was riotous and rebellious and spent the better part of his youth cavorting with Falstaff in the taverns of England. They loved prostitutes and drinking, and they used their evenings to hijack and rob travelers across the forest outside of London. So that was Prince Hal. He was a wild man, and he was reckless, and he reminded me in some fashion as this prince in waiting, John McCain. And by the way, if you get a chance, I recommend a couple movies. Firstly, Orson Welles' Chimes at Midnight. That actually incorporates Henry IV Part 1 and Henry IV Part 2. He adapted those 2 plays into a really compelling movie, and it really focuses on this relationship between Falstaff, played by Orson Welles, and Prince Hal, and their misadventures until the obligations of statehood and war pull Prince Hal into battle, and he has to confront his rival, and that's Hotspur. And Prince Hal, who was this goofball kid and had disappointed his father, meets Hotspur on the field of battle and slays him, and that sets the stage for his ascendancy to the throne, where he becomes Henry V and achieves heroic status when he leads the British Expeditionary Force across the Channel into France. And so I recommend that. Chimes at Midnight. It's one of Orson Welles' forgotten but really minor masterpieces, and a great adaptation of Shakespeare, if you can find it. And then also Henry V, which Olivier's Henry V, which is, I consider, not only one of the greatest cinematic expressions of Shakespeare, but it is one of the great movies of all time. And Henry V is stars Laurence Olivier, which he also directed. He also directed Hamlet. So his status as a movie director as well as an actor, in my view, is at the highest level. So catch up to Henry V. I mean, it's a fantastic movie. It starts in one of the more incredible opening shots, which is this long tracking shot over this model of what would be medieval London. It crosses the Thames River and then slowly descends into the upper aperture of what was the Globe Theatre during a production of this history play. And then over the course of they're filming this sort of live theater play as it was performed by the contemporary players in the 1600s with Laurence Olivier playing Henry V. It slowly transforms into sort of a magical movie, and it casts off the barriers of the actual theater and becomes a real movie. And it is just it's just fantastic. The movie was made right at the eve of World War II, and it was really a call to patriotism by the filmmakers, hoping to rally the British against their upcoming struggle against the Nazis. So get a chance, if you can, to see Laurence Olivier's Henry V. I consider it's a masterpiece. Now back to McCain, the McCain Prince Hal analogy. I think it works, up to a certain point, but it falters when McCain comes up a buck short of ascending to the American throne. That would be the presidency. So that's later in his life. But he famously, as we all know, got his ass shot down over Vietnam. And to many, he was, and perhaps is still, a bona fide hero. For me, that's a little bit up for debate. I had a discussion with some of my friends last night, and they were convinced he achieved, he was indeed a hero. I will say this, to be sure, he had the guts to fly off a heaving aircraft carrier deck and drop bombs on a third world country, which I'm not sure if that qualifies as heroism, ballsy absolutely, fearless for sure. But to me, heroism occurs when someone offers themselves up for the benefit of others. I'm not sure if bombing people in a third world country qualifies as heroic. I think he actually earned his hero stripes when he was shot out of the sky and was captured and found himself wounded and broken in body and spirit in the Hanoi Hilton. And at that moment, I think, is when he got his hero stripes, when he stood up to his Vietnamese captors for the benefit of his fellow prisoners, as I said, in that most famous of hotels, the Hanoi Hilton. All of which got me thinking about my own trip to Vietnam, which fortunately was not during wartime. I was able to go to Vietnam a few years ago, and it was sort of a life-changing trip for me. I saw these, the cemeteries, the rusted-out tanks, the tunnels in the jungle where frightened villagers sat out the bombing runs by Navy fighter jocks, the likes of which were McCain. And you could see the bomb craters, which still scar the rice paddies, which now make for fish ponds. And sadly, the defoliant still racks the people and the environment of that Eden-like country. Funny thing is, I had no idea how beautiful and enchanting Vietnam was until I went there. This place, which had been just such a horror show to so many, for me, when I arrived, felt like a kind of paradise. I mean, there were all these unsurfed river mouths and point breaks. After all, the country, Vietnam, sort of mirrors California in a way. It faces California, actually, all the way across the Pacific there, and it runs on a north-south axis with mountains down the middle. And as a surfer, there were, everywhere I went, there were these unsurfed river mouths and point breaks, lefts and right, not a surfboard or a surfer for miles. And I have to say, when I was there, I had maybe, the greatest day of my life when I rented a scooter, and I was staying in the imperial capital of Vietnam, the ancient imperial capital of Vietnam, and that is Hue. And it's dominated by the fortress that is where the ancient Vietnamese kings had lived. Actually, not so ancient, up until the 1940s, actually. And anyway, what I did was I rented this scooter, and after spending some great days tooling around Hue, I ventured up the winding roads across the jungles and rice paddies and up into the central highlands, where there were across these, very precipitous and gorgeous jungled mountains, completely, enshrouded in foliage, all the way up to what was and still is the Laotian border. And I went through these enchanting valleys and villages and rice paddies where so many GIs had drew their last breath. And I finally made my way all the way up to the fog-enshrouded highlands to a town or village, actually, called Khe Sanh. And that might ring familiar to many. Khe Sanh, also outside the town, was where there was this fire base, this American fortress, and it fell under siege. And I visited that abandoned fortress. I wouldn't call it a fortress, but it was an expanse, sort of a flat top near the top of these mountains in the highlands, and and it overlooked valleys and the the central sort of coastal area of Vietnam was splayed out to the east below the highlands that was dominated by Khe Sanh. And as I walked through the sandbag trenches of that long forgotten fire base, I couldn't help but feel so guilty for all the devastation and death that we, meaning we as Americans, poured onto that beautiful place in the form of bombs and defoliant and napalm. And I was up there, and I could see, as I looked out across through the fog, an abandoned C-47, some rusted out tanks, old pieces of bombs and airplane wings, so just all the detritus and wreckage and trash of warfare. And it occurred to me, which I knew this, but on this lonely patch of mountaintop jungle, it was this very lonely patch of mountaintop jungle that actually brought Lyndon Baines Johnson to the edge of a nervous breakdown. It was where he had to finally face the truth of the Vietnam folly, and because this fire base, Khe Sanh, was surrounded and under siege, and it threatened to be what for the Americans would be their own Dien Bien Phu. And of course, for those of you that don't know, Dien Bien Phu was the climactic battle where the French were surrounded and ultimately defeated by the North Vietnamese and had to vacate the country, which opened the way for the American entanglement. And so there I was at Khe Sanh, and all I could think about was Lyndon Johnson fretting this impending disaster, which ultimately forced him to abandon his quest for re-election, and all of which was precipitated by what happened at that lonely mountaintop at Khe Sanh. And so there I was. And I remember as a kid, I could never really, I could never see what my freedom had to do with beating the shit out of these courageous people over in Vietnam. And for me, I didn't go to Vietnam, thank God, as a warrior. But it did, the 10 years of that American war corresponded basically with my own youth. So from like 8 years old to 18 years old, meaning when I started college, the Vietnam War raged. It was on my TV every day, dispatch after dispatch, headline after headline, death count after death count, every day for 10 years, photos on Life magazine, Look magazine, the LA Times. You couldn't escape it. The violence that raged from far away in Southeast Asia found its way into my psyche, I think, quite powerfully. And when I was little, at the first stages, my dad was an ex-Marine, and the war over there in the jungle seemed to fit into that larger World War II paradigm, Americans fighting for freedom in some far-off place, handing out candy and Coca-Cola, just like in the movies, spreading democracy and sugar addictions across the world. But as I grew older and more conscious, what can I say, a different truth began to crystallize in my emerging sort of social consciousness. And I remember thinking, well, we're out there fighting for our freedom, but I never once saw a Viet Cong person in my comfortable neighborhood in Tarzana on the western edge of the San Fernando Valley. So, and believe me, we looked for the Viet Cong. We just couldn't find him. The whole McCain is a hero thing, okay, I've thought about it. He definitely achieved heroic status, albeit in a military misadventure that, what can I say? Has to be. You can't walk away from that. So, he was a loyal soldier, to be sure. He was a brave pilot, absolutely, and a defiant prisoner, most definitely. But hero, okay, he was. In all likelihood, McCain, he probably would have fulfilled his Prince Hal bad boy destiny. He would have completed that analogy and become president or king. But he stumbled over his own bad judgment when he selected Sarah Palin as his vice president, which in a weird way, at least to my mind, opened that goofball door to the Republican Party that the PVP charged through some 8 years later. The PVP, Putin's vice president, we know who he is, the billionaire brat boy. Anyway, McCain led what I thought was a very complicated and entertaining life. To his credit, people loved him. He inspired loyalty. He very much, especially when he ran for president, he embraced that maverick brand, which I kind of felt, honestly, was a little more bullshit than real. And by the way, I got to say this as an aside, I am fucking fed up with everybody and their goddamn brands. Everybody's got a brand now, don't ruin your brand. Anyway, the maverick brand, he sort of, I don't know. He was, I think ultimately he earned that brand, but there were times when, I don't know, I had my questions about it. I think truth be told, when you look at him historically, McCain was an old-fashioned militarist cut from the post-World War II Cold War mold. He was definitely a gung-ho dude. In his mind, there was no problem that a few boots on the ground or an aircraft carrier or a squadron of fighter jets couldn't fix. He was, to be sure, a huge booster of those military misadventures in Iraq and Afghanistan, which we are still paying for. I think his best moments were when he ran against Obama, and firstly when he stood up to those race baiters in his own party, and then more dramatically during his concession speech in 2008. So whether it was in the Hanoi Hilton or on the campaign trail, the guy seemed, in my mind, to gain way more stature in defeat than he ever did in victory. So his legislative accomplishments, I think the main one is the one that bears his name, the campaign finance reform bill known as McCain-Feingold, which was his own way to seek redemption for his involvement in the Keating 5 scandal of the late 1980s, which nearly ruined his Senate career as it was first starting. All of which, the corruption around that now seems quaint in view of the swamp we see swirling around this billionaire brat boy. And then For McCain, I think his last and greatest moment on the Senate floor came when he offered up a thumbs down to the bill to repeal Obamacare last year. So his last thumbs down gesture saved what's left of Obamacare, which is still under assault, as we know. And I think perhaps his greatest gesture, his most powerful moment, was the parting shot he offered up to the PVP from his deathbed. And by that I mean when he disinvited him to his own funeral, and to add insult to injury, for allowing the PVP's most hated rival, Barack Obama, to speak at his funeral. So he'll speak at McCain's funeral with his other vanquisher, another man who defeated him for the presidency, and that is George W. So that will be more salt in the gaping wound that is the American PVP. It's funny how things always roll back to the PVP, but the TV, the telenovela is so riveting. It's really just, I don't know, it's a once-in-a-generation happening. I mean, just watching the towering Trump inferno and all the flippers flying out of the windows, Flynn Cone, this one and that one. And now, conspicuously, at least for me, a new flipper, David Pecker, which brings me back to that fateful day, the morning after. It was, for me, a day of infamy. I was so devastated after those election results. There was just something so foul, so corrupt in the air. The whole country, I don't know, it just felt like a crime scene. You might as well have just put a big yellow tape around the whole United States. You could just smell it. You couldn't see it, but you could smell it. Just the stench of what had happened. And I was so devastated. I was in such a shock. It felt like the world was coming to an end. And at that moment, I could really imagine how my German grandparents really must have felt when they woke up one morning in 1938 and they realized that Adolf Hitler had assumed the chancellery of the Deutsche Republic. I could imagine easily now how they felt. So anyway, that morning I was so wrecked, infuriated and in shock. I did what I always do when the world seems bleak and life hopeless. I ran. That's right. And this time to my favorite winter surf spot, the Queen of the Coast, Rincon, up there near Carpinteria before you get to Santa Barbara, off of Bates Street. And there was a northwest swell running, and I knew that the waves would be peeling off the pointed indicators and offering speedy blue faces for me and my Flowmaster. What's my Flowmaster, you ask? It's that 10-foot, 4-inch magic carpet ride of a longboard, my cream tangerine. So what did I do? I strapped my cream tangerine on top of my car, and I headed north. It was a perfect November morning. The ocean and the birds and the sky, they were all indifferent to the catastrophe that had just occurred the night before. And I got up to Ventura on my way to Rincon, and I pulled off, and I did what I always do when I get up in that little neck of the woods. I took a look at C Street, check out the waves there, and they were nice, but I decided I would just push the extra half hour up the coast and get to Rincon. But first I was hungry, so what did I do? I stopped at a supermarket in Ventura for a sandwich and maybe a pickle. I was in a desperate craving for a cool, crunchy dill pickle. Sometimes I get those cravings. You can't surf hungry. Anyway, it was a suburban market. And it was slightly on the seedy side in an area near the beach that was yet to be gentrified in the heart of the WPL, Ventura, that's white people land. And as I got to the register, I looked at the news rack beside the cash register, and there I saw it. The National Enquirer, that famous tabloid, which was indeed run by that same David Pecker, who ironically had just accepted immunity in exchange for, I don't know. Anyway, there it was, my sandwich in hand. I was waiting at the checkout line. The headline, bold as any banner the day after Pearl Harbor, right there across the top line of the National Enquirer, in quotes, Hillary blackmailed FBI to kill corruption probe, exclamation point, end quote. And beside it was the previous week's issue of the National Enquirer, Hillary Hitman Tells All. Both issues plain as day for every overweight, undereducated, sugar-addled white suburban shopper. And you know who they are. Nixon's silent majority, the dim-witted deplorables spread out across this country. I know this sounds elitist and mean-spirited from me, but I knew that those headlines were not only right there in Ventura County, but they were at every cash register, at every suburban supermarket and convenience store across this country. And then I kind of got it. Okay. That kind of drivel, that kind of shit, that kind of real fake news is what's driving this election. And I kind of got it. Now, of course, more is coming to light. Ironically, this David Pecker dude, Pecker is now in a vice, and like I said, he was the CEO of the American media company, American Media. He was very close friends with the billionaire brat boy and a purveyor of fake news, and he had been spewing this poison out on behalf of his patron crime boss. And not only had been, spinning false stories about his opponent, namely Hillary, but maybe even worse, he had been bearing true stories about his patron, the billionaire brat boy. Real stories, buried, real stories from models and adult film actresses that could offend his Baptist base and scuttle his long-shot hopes for the presidency. So there it was. I finally got it. So, be that as it may, I got that sandwich. I headed up to Rincon, suited up, paddled out, and for maybe the first time in my career, I couldn't catch a wave. My stomach was in knots. I couldn't function. I was just too angry. Anyway, what else? I saw the KKKlansman the other night. My thoughts. Firstly, when I reflect on contemporary movies, I do have to restrain my inner competitiveness. I can't allow my own frustrations. As a one-time and wannabe movie maker who has spent really the last 20 years of my life starving for another chance, I don't want to let that frustration within me color my opinion of what I saw. But as a movie, I hate to say this, Spike, sorry, bro, I thought it was sort of muddled. I know nominally it was a true story, but frankly, it seemed far-fetched. It was hard to believe, at least as portrayed, in your movie. It kind of strained credulity. I thought that the prologue with Alec Baldwin and the documentary like Charlottesville epilogue at the end seemed gratuitous and heavy-handed, and it tried to make a point that was best made within the actual narrative. But whatever. If Spike wants to bludgeon us over the head with his point, so be it. After all, it is a point worth making. Anyway, on the narrative of this story about this black rookie cop infiltrating the Klan through the good offices of a fellow white and Jewish officer using the black guy's voice on the phone and the white guy's face in real life to infiltrate the Klan, frankly, it seemed hard to swallow for me, at least. As for the guys playing the Klansters, the Ku Klux Klansters, they seemed sort of, I don't know, such imbecilic goofballs. They reminded me like of those idiots in the I, Tonya movie. And to me, what made the KKK so dangerous and scary is that they actually were woven into the very fabric of American life. I mean, these would-be terrorists are really the same people you say hello to on the street every day. They were doctors and dentists, plumbers and barbers. That's what renders, the KKK insidious, is how deeply they were entrenched in just the normality of American life. But be that as it may, Spike had a different take. I guess he was trying to get it both ways, sort of get the dumber and dumber comedy value out of the KKK goofballs and scare the shit out of us. I'm not really sure. Having said that, I did really appreciate the performance of the gentleman who played David Dukes, something very normal and real about him, and that's what made him menacing. I thought the best scenes for me were with the white Jewish cop and the goofball Klansman. I never was really scared for him, but the Jewish cop, seemed to internalize his Jewishness in a way that seemed real to me, also a secularized Hebe. Anyway, it's funny that the Jewish guy actually seemed more real to me than the black guy, which kind of felt, the black guy sort of felt like 70s stereotypes right out of Superfly or Shaft. Anyway, whatever. My thoughts ultimately don't matter. I hope the movie makes money, and maybe inures to my benefit by carving out a space that will allow my screen stories to be told. Who knows? So I applaud you, Spike, for the storytelling bravery. If not, it's artistry, and what the fuck. He is at least still plugging away in movie land when everybody else is living in Netflix land. And frankly, that is an accomplishment in and of itself. It seems to me the likes of Netflix, Amazon, Hulu, Epix, and now Apple Movies, or whatever it's going to be, have overwhelmed my idea of what the movie business is. So, Spike, God bless you. His ability to navigate the system and get stuff made and to the screen, frankly, deserves its own Oscar, and that is nothing to be scoffed at. I know, because I sure as shit have not been able to do it. Still, actually, I think a compelling story about the Klan, and this is something that I would like to do, would be the story of Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was a cavalry officer in the Civil War, and he was insane, and he perpetrated a massacre of black soldiers at Fort Pillow, which was a battle in the Civil War, which included a cold-blooded massacre of black soldiers after they had surrendered at the hands of Nathan Bedford Forrest, who, after the war in defeat, formed the Ku Klux Klan. And that would be a compelling story. I'd like to see that done. But I got my own challenges right now, so that's a little bit off on the horizon. But I would love to see something like that told, because that's really the true story of American terrorism. So, on a personal front, I'm okay, I think. I'm very much been in this sort of in and out thing with my girlfriend. I think sometimes you need to break up with someone like 5 or 6 times to make sure you suck every last available ounce of misery out of that relationship. We'll see how it goes. We seem to be stuck in this kind of cycle where every time I get the last word, what I think is the last word is actually the first word of the next argument. So, I don't know. Hopefully I can get off this bipolar coaster into happier times one way or the other. But we are trending towards the ending of this podcast here of me, the rebel without applause. And I wanted to thank you once again for tuning in and joining me, myself and I, all 3 of us here, converging on this podcast. If you like it, hey, write a review, throw me some stars. If you don't, please keep it to yourself. And I will now bid you a very appreciative